Have you ever really thought about demonic possession? You know, that absolutely terrifying idea that some evil spirit could just take over a person's body? It's the stuff of nightmares, right? Total horror movie fuel. But what if the explanation isn't supernatural at all? What if the key to understanding all of this is actually hiding inside the human mind? Today, we're going to explore that unsettling line where belief, trauma, and science all collide. You've probably seen this phrase on a movie poster before. The film The Exorcism of Emily Rose scared audiences all over the world. But the truly haunting part, it's based on the real, tragic story of a young German woman named Anneliese Michel. And her story, well, that's where our investigation has to begin. So to untangle this whole mystery, we first have to go back and look at the absolutely chilling series of events that happened to Anneliese Michel. What's so wild about Anneliese's case is how you can literally trace its path from what seemed like a medical problem to a full-blown supernatural crisis. It all started back in 1968 when she was just 16 with a fainting spell. A year later, it happened again. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong. But by 1970, things really escalated. She was in the hospital for tuberculosis, but she started having these terrible hallucinations. That's when she got a diagnosis: temporal lobe epilepsy. Still, over the next few years, things just got worse, and she fell into a deep depression. By 1975, her family, who were deeply religious, were totally convinced she was possessed. They actually got the church's permission for an exorcism. And then, tragically, in 1976, after 67 of these rites, Anneliese died. So you have to wonder, what could possibly make her family believe this was something supernatural? Well, her behavior became incredibly disturbing. It's reported she would do 600 knee bends a day, just completely wrecking her ligaments. She once hid under a table and barked like a dog for 2 solid days. She was eating spiders, coal, even a dead bird. All the while, she claimed she was hearing voices telling her that she was cursed. Now, the priests who performed the exorcism, they didn't just claim it was one demon. They claimed there were 6 of them inside her. And the list is quite the lineup. You've got Lucifer, Cain, and Judas from the Bible, the Roman Emperor Nero, Adolf Hitler, and even a disgraced priest from the 16th century. What's truly astonishing is that you can still find audio recordings of these exorcisms online today where you can actually hear these different voices speaking through her. Anneliese's case is one of the most famous out there for sure, but it's not unique. And to show you this isn't just some isolated thing, let's look at another bizarre story before we get to the big question we're trying to answer here. So, about a decade ago, this American guy, Michael Boatwright, was found unconscious in a hotel room. When he woke up, he had zero memory of who he was, but he could speak fluent Swedish and was absolutely convinced his name was Johan Ek. It was like he had become a completely different person overnight. Okay, so these two cases bring us to the absolute core of the issue. What is really going on here? I mean, are we looking at actual evidence of a supernatural invasion where something from the outside takes over? Or is there a rational scientific explanation for how someone's identity can just shatter like this? Let's just lay out the two competing ideas side by side. On one hand, you have the supernatural explanation. An evil spirit invades a body, and the only way to get it out is through religious rites, like an exorcism. And on the other hand, you have the scientific view. This is a complex mental health condition that fractures a person's identity, and the mind creates these alternate personalities as a way to cope. And the treatment for that isn't religion, it's medical intervention. To really explore the scientific side, we need to dive into a very specific, and let's be honest, a very misunderstood area of psychology. You've probably heard this term before, right? Multiple personality disorder. It's all over the movies, from Psycho to Fight Club. It's the name everyone knows, but it's actually outdated. Science has since updated it to be a lot more accurate. So today, the correct clinical term is dissociative identity disorder, or DID. And the most important word in there is dissociative. See, this isn't about some outside entity coming in. It's about a single identity fracturing or dissociating into separate parts. So, how does our brain even build that sense of a single unified self in the first place? Well, the psychologist Carl Rogers broke it down into 3 parts. First, there is your self-image. That's the person you think you are. Second, there is your ideal self, the person you really want to be. And third is your self-esteem, which is basically determined by how big the gap is between those first 2. The closer they are, the higher your self-esteem. In cases of DID, that self-concept just shatters.
The different personalities that pop up are called alters, and each one can have its own name, age, gender, even its own unique set of memories. The original personality is called the host. When a person changes between them, that's called switching. And this is crucial, the host often has big memory gaps. No idea what happened when an alter was in control. If you want to see how extreme this can get, look up the case of Kim Noble, a woman with over 100 alters.
Okay, so we know what DID is, but why? Why does a mind fracture in such a profound way? Well, the answer, in the vast majority of cases, is heartbreakingly consistent. The root cause is really revealed in one staggering statistic. Study after study across the US, Canada, and Europe has found that in about 90% of all DID cases, the patient has a documented history of severe childhood abuse and trauma. So it's so important to understand this. Dissociation is not a sign of weakness. It's a profound, desperate survival strategy. When trauma is so overwhelming that a person just can't bear it, the brain essentially creates another person to take the hit. It protects the host by walling off that unbearable pain. All right, armed with this scientific framework, let's circle all the way back to the tragic case of Anneliese Michel and see how these ideas might apply to her story. Instead of 6 demons, the physicians who had actually treated Anneliese identified 3 very real medical issues. First, temporal lobe epilepsy, which we know can cause hallucinations and trance-like states. Second, anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder that explains her dramatic weight loss. And third, symptoms of an extreme religious delusion, an obsession with sin that could explain so much of her behavior. Her death wasn't supernatural. She died of starvation and dehydration. She weighed only 32 kilograms. And the legal conclusion to this tragedy was a landmark moment. A court actually convicted her parents and both priests of negligent homicide. And why? Because her death was preventable. She didn't need an exorcism. She needed ongoing, proper medical and psychiatric care. And what about Michael Boatwright, the man who woke up speaking Swedish? Well, his mystery was solved too. It turns out he had lived in Sweden for years. A traumatic event triggered something called a dissociative fugue, where his mind basically reverted to that past identity as a way to protect himself, completely erasing his more recent, painful memories. These stories really show us why understanding the science behind these conditions is so incredibly critical. The way we talk about them, especially in pop culture, has real-world consequences. For decades, movies have sensationalized DID. They portrayed patients as violent villains or even as jokes, and that kind of portrayal creates real fear and stigma. But thankfully, we are starting to see some progress. More nuanced films are coming out, showing people with DID not as monsters, but as complex human beings who are suffering and who are desperately in need of help and empathy. So let's just end with this thought. The stories of Anneliese and so many others suggest that the demons we're so afraid of are often just manifestations of deep, deep psychological pain. And if that's the case, then maybe the modern-day exorcism isn't some religious rite. Maybe it's the act of providing scientific, compassionate care. Maybe the real challenge isn't casting out evil spirits, but casting out the stigma and ignorance that stop people from getting the help they truly need.